Some Republicans are now pushing to use outside data to analyze what impacts their agenda could have on a national debt that's over $36 trillion and are considering reforms to the CBO.
Well, we know that historically federal tax revenues have been 17% of GDP. That's 17% of GDP over the course of time. And we know if the tax cuts are allowed to expire, that you will have a contraction in GDP.
Congressman Austin Scott of Georgia.
And so if you follow the CBO estimates, the way they are putting them forward, they are making the assumption that there is no contraction in the GDP of the country. And so they assume in doing that federal tax revenues would go up if you allowed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to expire. This is the same organization that assumed that if the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was passed, that you would have a tremendous reduction in federal tax revenues years ago. But in 2015, you had $4.31 trillion in tax, and then for 2024, we had $4.92 trillion in tax. And so just factually speaking, our federal tax revenue is going to go up if the GDP of the country goes up, and it's going to go down if the GDP of the country goes down. And if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is allowed to expire, it's going to pull tremendous sums of money out of the U.S. economy and where the private sector has access to that capital, and it's going to put it in the hands of the government.
Well, you gave a good example there with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but are there any other examples that come to mind when you felt the CBO had an estimate that was off, that was concerning?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you could go back to the Affordable Care Act. You can go back to what they call the American Rescue Plan. You can go back to what they call the Inflation Reduction Act. And so anytime when there has been an increase in spending or an expansion, if you will, of the federal government, the estimates have been on the low end of what would be the increase in spending. But then if you go back to conservative fiscal policy where we cut taxes, they said that our tax rate cuts would lead to a reduction in federal revenue. And when, again, you get to the specific example of the $4.92 trillion in 2024 under the current tax law versus $2.31 trillion in 15 before the tax law, and their estimates have just not turned out to be true. And so from a revenue standpoint, our revenue is going to be a percentage of the GDP of the country. If you allow the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to expire, you are going to see a contraction in the economy that is going to reduce the GDP and therefore reduce the tax revenue of the country. And if it expires, all of these other things that have been put in place, these increases in spending that have been put in place in the past, most of those provisions are still in the law today, and whether or not we can get a repeal of those provisions would remain to be seen. And ultimately, you end up with a higher deficit if you allow the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to expire.
And I think one thing we hear from pushback from the other side, they oftentimes will say that, well, yes, you might say that the revenues did go up after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act were passed, but did it go up enough to pay for itself? Because you did see those deficit numbers, especially pre-COVID, moving in the wrong direction despite the bill being signed into law in 2017.
The deficit has gone up. And if you look back, I think both parties are guilty of spending more money than we were taking in. You can go back just a couple of years ago, and when the Democrats had the House, the Senate, and the White House, Inflation Reduction Act, American Rescue Plan, as they called them, they were showing a net increase of about $3 trillion is what the CBO estimates were for those two pieces of legislation. They did those two pieces of legislation without a single Republican vote. When you go back, and so that's on them. If you go back into the COVID era, I think, hindsight's 2020 on this, but a lot of the things that we did in COVID were necessary, but there's also probably an equivalent amount of spending, about $3 trillion of what we did through COVID that we probably shouldn't have done in in those 2 years with the COVID spending. So both sides are guilty for the national debt being where it is. But I do think that the Democrats are the ones that are responsible for the current deficit being as high as it is when federal tax revenues have been higher than they've ever been in the history of the country. And they've continued to expand the government. And now we have to rein that government spending back in.
Now, what's interesting, though, with this new push for these Trump tax cuts is that there is a provision in the current House Republican bill that says, if you don't reach your $2 trillion goal when it comes to spending cuts, you have to go and take provisions away from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act or some of the other tax law that you're trying to put in here, the over $4 trillion, and pull provisions back from that in order to make up for that lost revenue. It just seems like maybe Republicans might be on a different page when it comes to if these tax cuts are going to pay for themselves or if we need to pay for the specific tax cuts.
Well, it obviously depends on where those tax cuts are and what a lot of the assumptions are. I'll give you one that I don't think is being taken into account. But as you know, pass-through entities right now have a maximum tax rate, I believe it is of 20%, but C Corp rate, or I'm sorry, 25%, but C Corps are at 20%. Well, if pass-throughs are going to be taxed at 39.6 and C Corps are going to be taxed at 20, then everybody who's got a pass-through entity will just change their corporate structure to a C Corp and pay it at the 20% rate instead of the pass-through rate. So there are a lot of assumptions in the law that or in the CBO estimates that if they're allowed to expire, would not come to pass with regard to what we are having to do in what I call a game of a Sudoku and trying to make sure that all of the pieces of the mathematical puzzle match is it's just that it's trying to make the pieces of the puzzle match. I do not believe that taking money out of the hands of taking any more money out of the hands of the individual taxpayers is going to lead to an increase in tax revenue over the course of a 5 or a 10-year period. It may lead to an increase in tax revenue over a short period of time, but over a long period of time, it would actually lead to a reduction in tax revenue.
And what do you think is the path moving forward here in terms of how Republicans utilize CBO data or don't utilize it at all? Because, we've heard from Blake Moore, member of leadership, says that,
Yep.
We don't want to ignore the CBO, but we also don't want to completely rely on it. And I believe you've also mentioned the idea of going to outside sources here to get intel from there and maybe do some math that way. Can you kind of get into that a little bit?
Right. And so the Joint Committee on Taxation is obviously a part of the CBO estimate. But we believe that we should be going to outside organizations that, whether they be economists or institutions that have had a better track record of more accurately predicting what the revenues or expenditures are going to be with major pieces of legislation and see what their estimates are. Now, certain assumptions are made around economic growth would be an example with any of the policies that are put in place. And there are organizations out there that have extremely good track records with regard to their estimates of policy changes. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to look not just at CBO and what the Joint Committee on Taxation says, but to look at the estimates that these outside institutions give us as well. And then we need to take the most accurate prediction, what we believe to be the most accurate prediction of economic output for the economy based on the tax policy, and that's the estimate that we should use. And again, tax revenues are going to be 17% of the economic output of the country.
And do you know which organizations you specifically would like to see be utilized and why?
I don't have a specific list in front of me. I think that there's some Again, I would go back to the track record, what they said, on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the ones that were more accurate there, the ones that were more accurate on the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm sorry, I don't have that list. I have seen a list of people that had pretty accurate revenue estimates, and these are not people that are necessarily fall into conservative or liberal ideology. They are people that have simply had a better track record of estimates over the course of time than CBO.
And do you think the CBO needs to be reformed in any way?
I think the law that surrounds CBO, the short answer would be yes, but then I also think the law that surrounds CBO needs to be reformed. And so if you look at if you look at how they handle the baseline assumes that the temporary tax cuts will expire, and they do not assume that there would be any change in economic output with the expiration of those tax cuts. And we all know that if you allow those tax cuts to expire, you're going to have a contraction in the economy, which will lead to a reduction in tax revenue. So obviously that is something that needs to be changed. If it is in the law, it needs to be changed in the law. If it is CBO policy, it needs to be changed in CBO policy. I do believe it is actually in the law, and so that's on us that it's in the law, not on CBO.
And do you think there is congressional action that could be taken to make those changes that you're talking about right now?
I think it should be taken. I do not think with the Democrats having a 60 vote, with the 60 vote threshold in the Senate, I do not think it will be taken prior to us moving the legislation forward.
So would that involve something that you could put into reconciliation? And is there any specific legislation that you have in mind that you could be putting forward that would address this?
There are discussions, but I'm not aware of any actual language that has been presented in the form of legislation.
What are those discussions like? Well, what's the main issue here, and how do you think they get there?
With regard to the baseline?
Yeah, the CBO.
I think I think that the baseline should take into account the changes in the economy if the tax law is allowed to expire.
And what happens next year with the House budget plan? Because you've got this situation where the Senate is kind of moving on this bill. It looks like as we are doing this recording, Leader Thune has come out and said that they're going to have a vote this week. What should House Republicans' plan be? Do they try to pass their bill as it is or make amendments so that it does pass, and then you kind of lead to a negotiation down the road? What's kind of the topic here the plan here with the Senate kind of moving forward already?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm happy the Senate's moving forward, and I'm happy that the House is moving forward. And I think what you'll see over the next couple of weeks is the Senate will pass a piece of legislation and the House will pass a piece of legislation. And then once those two pieces of legislation pass, then you probably see negotiations from those two pieces of legislation that have passed. So I will tell you, weeks ago, I had hoped that the House would be able to move faster. As you know, we have a very slim margin in the House of Representatives. It sometimes is a little harder to get on the same page. And if Senator Thune has the votes to pass his legislation, then I think he will go ahead and pass his legislation. And so I'm fine with the Senate moving ahead with their piece of legislation. And then we as House Republicans, we need to continue to push ahead with our legislation. And so if both pieces of legislation pass, obviously you have to choose which one is going to go through both the House and the Senate. And we can work from the two pieces and end up with some type of what I would call at the state level, we called it a conference committee report, and some type of conference report where we take some of the House and some of the Senate and ultimately end up with an agreement that can pass both chambers.
And do you think the current number in terms of the tax cuts on the trillion level is sufficient enough, especially with that provision that says that there could be some of it could be rolled back? And President Trump's got a pretty ambitious agenda here, not just renewing the Trump tax cuts, but also adding no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, and some other aspects there too, like bringing back the SALT deduction.
Yeah. All of that, again, has to be taken into account, and each and every one of those has a cost, if you will, in the estimate that has to be accounted for. But again, the more money that you leave in the hands of the United States taxpayers, the more the economy is going to grow, and total tax revenues are going to be somewhere around 70% of GDP. And that's where I think, Trump, being the business owner that he is and understanding economics the way he does, I think that, his push forward with, expanding the GDP of the country and the economic output of the country is ultimately what's going to lead to higher tax revenues for the country.
All right, Congressman Austin Scott from the great state of Georgia, always appreciate the time, and thank you for joining us.